You know, having a treasured belonging amounts to identifying what we really treasure. Now, one way to do that is to think, if I had a fire or I had to leave home quickly, what would be the first things that I would try to take with me? In many cases, it may be photographs, because photographs are very difficult to replace in this day and time. Maybe not with the more digital photographs that you have now, where you have them on a hard drive or you have them on a flash drive that you keep in your purse. But some of the older antique photos you would have a more difficult time replacing. So maybe some of the very, very old photos would be the ones that you would grab in an instance if you had to leave, or if you had to decide to pack and had maybe a few hours notice on what you could take. That begins to narrow things down quickly in terms of antiques and keepsakes and treasured belongings too. What would you take with you? What would be the top 10 things that you treasure most? Now, throughout the month, the Extension Homemaker Clubs throughout the Tin County, Mammoth Cave area have been looking at this program today, and they have actually been taking a worksheet and identifying their top 10 treasured belongings and why it would be treasured, what the sentimental value or the story would be that's connected with those items and why they treasure that. And then, of course, you can take a look at, once you identify the things you like most, you can look at the categories, because treasured belongings can be very different. For instance, a treasured belonging can simply be a keepsake of something. A keepsake can be as simple as collecting Christmas ornaments, brass Christmas ornaments that are, again, keepsakes from a particular trip that you take as a family or trip that you take as a professional anyway. Like when you visit somewhere unique or special, you buy a keepsake to remember the activity and event. You know, I started collecting Christmas ornaments many, many years ago, and started actually with the little inexpensive Christmas ornaments that are stamped out of inexpensive brass that have different reminiscences or phrases about the object. This one actually came from Montana, and it has an elk, and it has a bear, and it has the outline of the mountains and different things like that. This came from Glacier National Park. On the other hand, and this probably was like $3.99, no more than that, very inexpensive. This one, of course, is from the Biltmore House, a little more expensive, made of a little more durable material. So this one cost a little bit more. And then this one, of course, is in a collector's series for the White House or the Capitol. This was actually one of the Capitol series that was a 2003 holiday ornament that I collected there too. Or again, they can have a little more color on them, but all of these, this is the Grand Ole Opry House in Nashville, the Ryman Auditorium that has a little color, but still continuing that brass theme. And then finally the Starfish, which is very different with a lot of glitter, gold glitter on it that continues the gold and brass and shiny theme, but this from Monterey, California. So these become keepsakes to me, remembering a specific trip, the people that you're with, the events that you share. Those are not worth a lot of money, but they're treasured because, again, they have great memories around them. Keepsakes or treasured items could also be antique or heirlooms. This particular keepsake is one of my grandmother's that she actually dated from a Sunday school picnic that she has purchased at some of the old souvenir shops that used to line Highway 31E and 31W between Louisville and Nashville, or even down to Chattanooga, Tennessee, etc., and over toward the Smoky Mountains. Wherever the Sunday school, the church, had gone to a picnic, and she purchased this little box, this little cedar box, as a keepsake. But it has now become an heirloom because it is now passed down through generations. This is actually dated from the Sunday school picnic of 1944. So it's now getting age to it. In fact, now is over 50 years old, over 60 years old. So now it's beginning to fall into the category of antique and heirloom because it was in the family for multiple generations. Many of the objects can become that way. You will also maybe collect jewelry from family members that become heirlooms. Think this was a grandmother's necklace. Maybe you have earrings or pins or brooches, etc. Maybe you collect collectibles. Collectibles themselves can fall into the idea of coins. These are coins that my family has collected, from gold or foreign coins to old silver dollars, and even the Susan B. Anthony dollar that is relatively new, but still a $1 bill. And here the old silver dollar is much larger and tarnished and much older. So maybe you collect coins, and the coins themselves may become an heirloom that you pass down, as some of the coins may be antiques at this point, maybe even approaching 100 years old. Many of the old pennies and dimes, etc., or dollars, could very well be antiques. So collectibles can be antiques, and they can become heirlooms if passed down. This is an old piece of pottery, a pottery crock that was actually used probably to put milk in. It has a ceramic liner that my grandparents had, maybe even came from their parents, maybe great-grandparents or things like that. It may be functional pieces of daily living. You know, here in the South, we do enjoy collecting those things, be they quilts or crocks, again, that represent, again, kitchen tasks, where people even use those in food preservation, etc., for making pickles, etc. You would use crocks to actually work those, and maybe those now become collectibles. But in your family, they have stories. They are antiques that are heirlooms that have stories that become things that you share about that particular family member and become a tie that binds. Or perhaps it's something more recent, as we said, like photos. Photos, though, that are passed down from generations. Photos that become heirlooms because of, again, the frames that they're actually put in or collected. You know, these being relatively new, but then adding black and white and sepia tone modern photos to mix in with antique photos to create collections that become heirlooms that are passed down, again, to multiple generations. As we said, an antique itself very often is identified differently depending on the antique. Antique cars, for instance, may not have to be 50 years old to be considered an antique and to receive an antique tag, whereas pieces of furniture may need to be at least 100 years old to be considered an antique. And with some antique purists, those antiques, especially with furniture, may be set from the time of the industrial age started and mass production to the time before or after that something that's handmade. Again, in our part of the country, things continued to be handmade well beyond after 1830, which is the time when a lot of furniture began to be mass produced in the industrial age. We had lots of handmade furniture that was made on the farms, etc., well beyond that, and you maybe even find handmade furniture made well into the early 1900s. And for instance, I have a table, an old pie table it was called, that was handmade, that of course was used in an old kitchen where pies were made and put in a huge drawer and set in there to keep the insects away and to keep them, allow them to be cool but yet to be protected. That furniture piece is all handmade with dovetail joints and pieces of chestnut, again, that for a long period of time was not available because of the chestnut blight back in the early part of the 20th century. And so we tend to have a lot more handmade items beyond 1830. But at least 100 years is probably going to begin to put you back in terms of furniture and to be able to call it an antique. And then, of course, it depends on its collectible value. You know, this particular picture that is made was one that my grandmother made. She actually made this in a Homemaker Club lesson. You know, it's something where she actually took a piece of copper and actually pressed the picture, and then it was put on a board and framed. You know, it didn't have a lot of value. It was a craft that was made with her, but now it could easily become a collectible because of the interest in artisan crafts today. The interested in using different materials such as metals and certain woods and certain pieces of glass that were representative of arts and crafts that were done, as we said, in the early part of the 20th century. Something made by hand. So this simple little picture now has a very definite collectible value in terms of a monetary value as well. But with me, it's more the story of remembering this particular picture and where it was placed in my grandmother's home over, again, an old icebox That was a part of her household, and it reminds me of her each time I look at that. It brings the memory back as well. And so, considering your items as far as your top 10, you may have very different types of items. You may have items that are again, very, very old, that are antiques and heirlooms, and definitely collectible too. Or you may have an item that is very new, but for your immediate family, it becomes something treasured because it brings back a memory. It doesn't have any monetary value, but it has a lot of sentimental value, and on and on. So identifying those heirlooms becomes the thing you want to do, and to be able to start sharing the stories about all the things that I have here. You know, what I need to think about is if I shared the story about the people in the photo. Do we know who they are, etc. And in a moment, we'll be right back and we'll talk about preserving those stories, preserving the items, and what are you doing to keep the items safe, and some of the different methods to consider. Stay with us. We'll be right back.